Hello and welcome to another video series here on ModernNexus.com. My name is Ryland, also known as Holy Shamgar on Twitch. And today we're playing with Blue-Red Breach. For anyone who's unfamiliar with the list, it has started popping up probably about a couple months ago or so, here and there on Magic Online. And at its base is pretty similar to Blue Moon decks we've seen in the past, but instead of employing a full-on kind of control game plan, it's looking to play a little bit more of that tempo role and then finish with the sort of A plus B combo of Through the Breach and Emrakul the Aeon's Torn. So of course that allows us to attack, put an Emrakul into play with haste and attack with it, triggering Annihilator 6 so that our opponent has to sack 6 permanents and usually dealing them 15. Emrakul can be blocked by flyers or I guess things with reach, so that's certainly something to keep in mind when you're playing this deck. There are times where your opponent can sort of keep, if they have more than 6 permanents, they can keep the right permanents, maybe block your Emrakul, and then you might not have a way to finish out the game. That's definitely something to keep in mind and kind of one of the deck's weaknesses, on top of maybe they're at more than 15 life and you don't have a way to finish out the game and they have enough permanents to sack, things like that. But typically, if you're casting a Breach on turn 5 or so, it's probably good enough. Most of the time it's good enough, but there have been times where you cast Breach and do not win the game, unfortunately. But even if it resolves, I mean, of course. So to support this sort of game plan, like I said, we've got this tempo plan. So we're all in on Remands. This card is outstanding in the deck. Obviously, it doesn't really deal with any threats, but it postpones them while also drawing us a card, which is pretty much all we want to do, right? Go through our deck as quickly as possible, try to find both of these pieces, try to find 5 lands, and cast Breach. So Remand certainly does that job for us. As far as similar cards, we obviously have Cryptic Command, Counter and Draw. Obviously, this does deal with the actual threat rather than Remand, but at a twice the mana cost. Obviously, we have other options for Cryptic, which is very, very relevant. Tapping our opponent's team to buy us some time, bouncing a problematic permanent to buy us some time, stuff like that. But again, just kind of sort of counter magic and an interaction to do something to stall and draw a card to get us closer to this. On top of that, we've got sort of this package of cantrips. Right now I'm on 4 Serum Visions and 3 Opts. I might be interested in finding room for the 4th Opt. I don't want to cut a Serum Visions for it. I think 4 Serum Visions is definitely where you want to start, but I have slowly increased the number of Opt as I've been playing this deck. I think obviously the lists a couple months ago didn't have Opt since it was pre-Ops reprinting, but recent lists have showed up with maybe 2 Opts. I think I even saw a list with like 4 Opts and 2 Visions. I'm not really a big fan of that, but I think I might want the full 8. If you're playing any less than 8, I think you should be on 4 Visions, but I suppose that's another discussion for another time. As far as the Counter Magic Suite goes, I'm on 1 Spell Snare. We do have another in the board. For a while I was on 2 Spell Snare, and Spell Snare is a very feast or famine card, so I kind of don't like, in Modern right now I should say, so I kind of don't really like playing maybe more than 1. I can respect the 2nd, but I think it might be a little much. And like I said, to expand on that a little bit, I think there are some matchups where Spell Snare is incredible. It's just all you ever want to draw. And then there's just some matchups where Spell Snare is literally dead. I mean, sometimes you'll be playing against Storm and you're like, this counters all your rituals, this counters Electromancer, this counters Brawl, this counters Remand, this card's great. And then sometimes you'll be like, you'll sit down, your opponent will play a land, cycle a creature, and they're on living end, and you're like, well, they have literally nothing. This can't hit a thing. And obviously that's kind of the extreme, but there are other matchups. There are plenty of matchups in Modern where Spell Snare is just not that exciting. But it's so powerful that I think it's still worth having access to. I could see maybe eventually this turning into an Opt, but I just feel like having the 1 is fine. Other than that, we've got a couple Blood Moons. I kind of alluded to those earlier by comparing the deck to Blue Moon, but Blood Moon obviously sort of fits our deck in the same way, where yeah, you can get your free wins off of Blood Moon, but largely it's here to buy some time, make our opponents mana awkward so they can't really do what they need to do to win the game very quickly. They're slow, clunky, they can't cast very many spells. It's not hurting us very much as just a 2-color deck that can support a lot of basic islands. So it really buys us some time. We only have the 2. I think 2 in the main is correct, but I guess we'll get to this a little bit more. I'm not crazy about the current sideboard that I have. I think it is a little bit clunky. I think it's the area that could use the most work, but I do think this deck in general could use a lot of tuning, but I think that's one of the areas in particular. I wouldn't mind having a 3rd, maybe a 4th in the board, but I think a 3rd would be good to find room for. Other than those Blood Moons, we also have a little burn package of Lightning Bolt and Electrolyze. And these are important in the deck for 2 reasons. Obviously, 1, we need to be able to remove early things that our opponent casts, again, to buy us some time. Lightning Bolt, not really premier at doing that in Modern anymore, right? We have threats now like Death Shadow, Tarmogoyf, things that are just huge that, I mean, Tarmogoyf's been around for forever, but you get the idea that the format's pretty hostile to Lightning Bolt currently. But it's still just so good against things like, Affinity or Bird of Paradise decks or whatever else. And beyond that, in just blue-red, we don't really have a better option, right? Lightning Bolt's kind of what we've got. We don't have access to Fatal Push. We don't have access to Path. And if we're interested in supporting Blood Moon, splashing for either of those cards is probably not a wise idea. So, anyway, that's one reason we have Bolt. And then the second reason we have Bolt is our combo only does 15 damage, right? Sometimes we need to find a way to get the remainder of that damage done. And some people's mana bases don't hurt them a bunch. Some people you can depend on to deal at least 5 damage with their mana base, right? But sometimes you're going to play against, mono white taxes, or sometimes you'll play against Merfolk or whatever else where you don't really expect them to take any damage, hardly any damage from their mana base. And then the third reason we have Lightning Bolt is for our plan B. Our plan B is very similar to something like Twin's plan B in the past. Now, I do think if we're going to compare this deck to Twin, we have to be pretty upfront that our plan B of just, chip-shotting them slowly over time is much, much worse than the plan B that Twin has to offer. But it's still comparable, right? We still want to sort of evaluate them similarly. And that plan B, of course, is just our tempo, bolt snap, bolt shoot, get you with click here and there. Obviously, the biggest difference between us and Twin is if you compare these to the actual card Splinter Twin, and then these to what? Pestermite, right? And Pestermite's wonderful in that plan B, where you're just casting this 2/1 flash flyer, tap a guy, and getting in for some chip shots. Emrakul does not really get in for some chip shots. You don't really fair cast Emrakul here and there just to get a little bit of damage done, right? And that's what makes this deck really so much worse than Splinter Twin, right? Which, of course, is a sense-banned deck, so obviously not really important that it's worse than Splinter Twin, just I think worth noting why it's so much worse than Splinter Twin, and I think it's just really this. Now, obviously, the other issue that makes it worse than Splinter Twin, if we're touching on that real quick, is that Through the Breach sometimes does not kill your opponent, right? Sometimes you will Through the Breach and Emrakul, and you will lose the game. That does happen. That doesn't, if you're resolving your combo and you have Splinter Twin, you're winning. Now, obviously, there are more ways for our opponent to interact with that, whether it's, removal for our Pestermite or Deceiver Exarch or whatever, than there are for them to interact with an Emrakul, but it's still worth noting that if you get your combo off when you're Splinter Twin, you're winning the game. If you get your combo off when you're Through the Breach Emrakul, you may not. But again, if we're going to talk about the comparisons, one of the small upsides of being this over Twin is that, yeah, stuff like Abrupt Decay, not as good, right? Stuff like Abrupt Decay, not going to stop us from killing them with Breach Emrakul. Path, not going to stop us from killing them with Breach Emrakul, stuff like that. But anyway, that aside, we do have this backup tempo plan, worse than Twins, but a backup tempo plan of click, Snapcaster, Bolt, Electrolyze here and there. These Electrolyzes kind of have to keep fighting for their spot. They draw a card, which is a huge upside for me, especially in a deck like this where we're just trying to buy time, filter through our deck. But they're kind of feast your famine too. You know, there are some matchups where these are just atrocious. You know, you're going to play against Death Shadow and you're like, well, I don't want to 2U because I'm going to grow your Death Shadow. I can't kill your Death Shadow, and I'm certainly not going to be able to kill your Tasigur. So I guess, you know, there's been times where I've been like 1 Deer Death Shadow, 1 Deer Tasigur. I just want to draw a card and can't afford to 2U, right? That's pretty embarrassing for your 3 mana. You're just cycling a card and you're like, don't want to actually deal damage to anything. But again, it's hard for a draw a card to be truly atrocious, so I'm not sure I really want to go down below 2, because then there's some times where you're going to be playing against something like Affinity, and you're going to kill 2 creatures and draw a card and feel like there was nothing better you possibly could have done in your life. Or you're going to play against the, you know, mono white Taxus deck and kill like a Flicker Wisp and a Thalia, or, you know, whatever else. 2 Flicker Wisps, whatever, you know. So I think this could be an area we could potentially shave on at some point. Obviously, I mentioned the Spell Snare as well. Sort of the second click, but I don't really feel like you can afford to go down less than 2 clicks, since that Plan B tempo plan that I described already needs so much help. I don't really think cutting a click is a real option here, but it's close, right? Other than that, I'm pretty happy with most of the other cards that we're playing. Maybe a 3rd Cryptic could ever hit the bin. I don't really see that one. And then you could make sort of a backwards argument for the, not even really backwards, but you could make a little bit of a stretched argument for cutting the 23rd land when we're going up to the 8th 1 mana cantrip. But let's talk about that mana base a little bit while we're talking about that. So let me move some of these over here. So our mana base, we've got quite a few fetch lands and quite a few islands. This, of course, is to help support our Blood Moon adventure. And then we've got some non-islands, right? So, namely, we've got blue fetches. Doesn't really matter which. Obviously, Scalding Tarn does matter, right? There are lots of times with this deck where you want to fetch the basic mountain, especially because you're going to be Blood Mooning yourself anyway. And you're usually only going to have 1, maybe 2 red sources. So, I think it's interesting to talk about this mana base a little bit, though. So let's get a little more into that, right? So we've got all these fetch lands. Now you'll see a lot of lists play probably the 8 fetch lands, just the 8 usually. A lot of lists are on like 7 islands, and then you'll see a lot more Sulphur Falls. And I did originally start playing with a lot more Sulphur Falls, but I found that there would be too many hands where I would draw some combination of Sulphur Falls, Lighthouse, Mountain, and Steam Vents, and my Blood Moon. And then I'd be staring at my hand of just all non-basic islands or ways to find them and be pretty sad. So I've ended up adding both a fetch land to keep my red source count high and a island rather than the 3 Sulphur Falls I was originally playing, and haven't really looked back. I very rarely find myself lacking in an ability to produce a red source. And I really just want to make sure that my Blood Moon draws are reasonable. And I really don't want to cut these lighthouses or the basic mountain. And I think 2 Steam Vents is really the minimum, especially when I'm down on Sulphur Falls. You could get got, I guess, by some large amount of Tech Edges and Spreading Seas and stuff like that. But honestly, more Sulphur Falls isn't always really going to help you against that, since you have to draw those naturally. You can't fetch them. If anything, I would probably go up a Steam Vents. I think it's just greedy to play a bunch of Sulphur Falls and hope that, you know, you'll draw them when it's right and you won't draw them when it's wrong. I would rather have these fetchables. Maybe if there was a Battle for Zendikar, blue-red, not fast land, but the requires you to have 2 basics to come into play, untapped lands that have the typing on them. Maybe I would play one of those if that existed. Of course, it doesn't exist for that color pair, but probably would play some number of those if they did. And then the one other important thing to mention here is the Desolate Lighthouses. I really think 2 is the right number here. It seems like a lot, perhaps, especially when we're talking about trying to keep our island count high for Blood Moon, but it's just so powerful in the deck. Again, just trying to loot to find the cards we need is just so key here. So that's our main deck. Again, I said our sideboard needs a little bit of work, but Explosives very powerful against any 2 or 1 drops. Might be weird to see Explosives in our 2-color deck, but it's been outstanding for me so far. I've been really happy to have it. Anger, I think, is pretty good, but double red can cost us. Roast good against the Eldrazi decks. can be a little bit of a clunker. We'll probably talk about that more later. Jace, Architect of Thought for any grindy matchups. I've liked this so far. Obviously, a Keranos could be in this spot as well. I've liked the Jace. It's been good against Lingering Souls for me as well, whereas Keranos maybe would be a little less exciting there. Obviously, it's cheaper than Keranos. The double blue doesn't bother us, so I don't know. We'll think about that. Staticaster I've enjoyed quite a bit. Byforce is an interesting inclusion. I think we'll talk about this a little more in the future as well, but Byforce, Overshattering Spree. It's hard for us to have a lot of red sources, which we kind of mentioned with the anger as well, but I guess not hard for us to have a lot of red sources isn't the right way to describe it, but often we're discouraged from producing a lot of red sources, right? We want to support our Blood Moon as much as possible by producing a lot of basic islands so that our Blood Moon doesn't really hurt us. We can still cast Cryptic, even Snap Cryptic if we are so fortunate, stuff like that. So Byforce a little bit better than Shattering Spree for us, although I think Shattering Spree by and far typically the better card. Ceremonious Rejection, really enjoyed that card. Obviously, it's great against both Affinity and Eldrazi Tron. 3 Dispels, I think this might be a lot. Maybe this is somewhere we can cut in the future. Although I think they're not bad, right? I mean, there's going to be those matchups where we definitely want them. I think you probably want them against Burn. And then the control matchups where people are trying to counter your Breach, you're going to want access to them. But obviously, because Breach is an instant, you get this kind of line of play that comes up a lot where you can Breach EOT into untap Breach if you either have multiple Breaches or expecting a Remand or something like that. But Dispel obviously helps that sequence even more. So you're typically going to want to see those, but maybe 2 Dispel would be fine. And then lastly, we've got this additional Spell Snare. Like I said, there are some matchups where it's just insane. I think 2 Spell Snare in the 75 is probably what I want. So I don't think I'm going to be shaving on that. But yeah, I guess we'll play the league out and then maybe talk about some potential cuts in the wrap up. But either way, that's your introduction to this list, I suppose. I hope it helped if you were unfamiliar, and let's go ahead and get to those games. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in a bit.